Hello. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for being here. I'm Sherry Geldon, and I have to say that one of the great pleasures, always, for 25 years, of presiding over a place like this is magical moments like this one, where we, the Wexner Center, can serve as a kind of vibrant, multidisciplinary platform for encounters and conversations of all kinds around a mix of creative practices and by inviting the foremost leaders in their respective fields. Sometimes the WEX even finds itself, often I should say, playing what I think of as a kind of cultural Cupid, where we are literally introducing these creative people to one another for the first time, and then we just stand back and let the creative sparks fly. It's always a great time, and that's certainly going to be my role tonight, because we've got some real firecrackers for you. So, it was really obvious to us once we were able to secure Todd Oldham's exhibition that we would want to, especially for Columbus, for the Ohio State University, for CCAD, to build some programming around it that really allowed all those budding designers and fashionistas in town to hear from some superstars in the field. And tonight we have not just any two legends of the industry, but Todd Oldham, who is the maverick designer, having spent a full decade in the 90s deliriously upending the customs of runway couture, and Michael Weiss, whose remarkable nearly 5-decade career of retail savvy propelled him to the stature of an industry icon. By way of just the briefest background, Todd Oldham is, of course, an artist and designer of rare talent across many, many different genres, rare ingenuity and daring in each, and well beyond that decade of ravishing, if sometimes raucous and even radical runway creations, has made a career of designing everything from interiors, furniture, fabric, housewares, children's clothing, and something near and dear to his heart, craft kits for both adults and children. That's not even mentioning the photography, the film, and the various other fields that he has managed to infiltrate with great creativity and wit. Whatever his chosen métier across all of those and more, I think it's fair to say that he is driven by an almost promiscuous talent and penchant for finding inspiration in all manner of things. And certainly you see that in the exhibition that's on view here at the Wexner Center through April 15th, whether it's among museum treasures or in garage sale trinkets or vintage catalog illustrations, you name it, even keen memories of his days foraging through the bazaars of Tehran, where he spent some years growing up. Michael Weiss spent the entirety of his working life in the business of fashion retailing, first in New York, and of course since 1981, here in Columbus, where he joined Limited Brands, now L Brands, and for nearly 3 decades there, occupied key executive positions. Among them, of course, was turning what was 8 funky experimental stores into a chain of more than 600 shops known as Express, which under his wizardry became a $1 billion-plus enterprise from virtually nothing. He retired from there in 2015, having served simultaneously as chairman, president, and CEO. But none of that captures the essential persona or the brilliant intuition of Michael Weiss, who I have had the pleasure of knowing almost since the day I arrived here in Columbus. So let me just share one illustrative anecdote that kind of gives you a sense of Michael's self-deprecation amidst all that brilliance. So When asked about his uncanny ability to stay ahead of the fashion curve, Michael cheekily cited his memory of joining the crowd watching President Lincoln's funeral train pass. Noting that the women's generously hooped skirts hampered the assembly, he turned to an associate and said that they really needed to get rid of those hoops and shorten the skirts so that it would be easier for women to negotiate in large crowds. So not only brilliant, but a feminist to boot, from way back. Clearly, our guests tonight have amazing stories to tell and insights to share, which is why I am so keen to bring them to the stage. So without further ado, let me introduce them this way. After seeing Todd's meticulously crafted and exquisitely embellished creations on view in our galleries, one of our colleagues here at the Wex, Alana Ryder, who is our head of public and university education programs and who I thank for helping put this together this evening, reverentially dubbed Todd Oldham the Marquis of Muchness. So, who better to match the fearless feats of fashion than our very own Merlin of merchandising, Michael Weiss. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Jerry. You used it.
So I'm going to try and keep twisting my neck, but it's not an exorcist moment, I promise. It's just that I don't want to turn my back to anyone here, certainly not our guests tonight. So thank you both again for being here. We're thrilled to have you. I told Todd when we welcomed him back here today that this has been one of our most successful exhibitions. Among all ages and all backgrounds, people are just loving this show.
That's
so
very lovely.
Thank you.
I'm most flattered
Thank
by
you
that.
so much.
Thank you.
So I don't know about all of you, but I know that when I'm kind of coming into contact with creative geniuses like this for the first time, I want to hear something of a secret origin story. I want to know what it was back then in that formative moment that propelled them to the extraordinary achievements that these two have managed. So with that, in whichever order you choose, age and beauty doesn't matter. Tell us a little bit about maybe that moment when you kind of knew design would be your calling, and maybe more specifically fashion design.
Well, I wasn't sure about fashion early on, but design I definitely understood. I remember sitting in my parents' backyard, I guess my backyard also, and looking at my corridors, which were actually the same color as this, and the sky at the same time, thinking there was some relationship between these two colors and their value. I can't even exactly explain why I was so moved, but there was something about color proximity that locked at that moment. And it just never stopped. It just it just increased the more I could see connective tissue between not only color and form, but then ideas and artistry, and then history started entering into it, and I just drove my parents crazy. Yeah.
Michael?
Well, I grew up in Brooklyn many years ago, and in the community that I lived in Brooklyn, because Brooklyn is not one place, it's more like Tokyo, neighborhoods. It really is. But there was very few things that you could do when you got older based on what you saw around. The thing you were supposed to do is make everybody proud by being a doctor. You remember that?
I remember that.
Right.
I was supposed to be a lawyer.
You were supposed to be a lawyer. Well, that was the second thing.
The second wave.
The second thing was a lawyer, and the third, believe it or not, in those years, it was very well thought of was being a teacher. So if you couldn't, and that was a good job,
Yes, it is a good job.
and you did good, you know. And if you didn't do that, you had to go somehow in business, right? And most of the people that I knew were in the apparel business. And my parents were in the apparel business. And I don't know that it was environmental or genetic, but there you go.
And the rest is history.
Yeah, the rest is history, like the Lincoln story, which I'm so glad you used.
When he sent me that in his bio, I thought, really? So I think one of the intriguing things about the two of you in conversation is that although of different generations and different paths within the fashion world, you both took tremendous inspiration from what I'll just call the street. Not just in terms of scavenging materials and ideas, but literally from the people in the street. And I think it would be kind of interesting to hear some, 20, 30 years apart, what that street culture meant to you.
Well, by street, what's interesting to me about observing the street is not the fashion of the street, but the everydayness of the street, or the workers' uniforms, or, I love costumes are fascinating. And I love looking back historically to see just the way the seams moved around. I mean, there's so many incredible facets of history that can be revealed by looking at fashion. I mean, even when you think about, in 16th century, it was of course you wanted to admire royalty who had heavily embellished clothes, but most people could never afford that. So they started puncturing fabric and washing it to abrade it, and a puncture would bloom and sort of create a texture, and they could do magnificent things which are just as fascinating as hand embroidery. So what you can learn about the time socially, and then what you can learn about actual art making is incredible. So I always say to learn as much as you can about, everything.
All about
Good
everything.
tip, yeah, truly.
Michael, how about you?
Well, excuse me. I was always in the young fashion business. And I know there are a lot of people out here that are from Express, and that's nice, but they've heard this before because it's things I really believe. And in the young fashion business, what you were primarily concerned with was trend. Because unless you identified trends, you couldn't sell enough of something to make any profit. And some people are in the fashion business, but we were in the business of fashion. Very different perceptually. So I spent years, we were in Europe 4 times every year, doing what I used to call breathless, hysterical trend chasing. But eventually that gets left for very young people, except they don't sometimes see things in perspective of the year before, the year before, the year before, because in order to really connect the dots, you have to know what the dots are. Exactly. And that's a very big deal, because it's not just, I love that. It's not just what it is.
So it's trend setting on a trend mill that
Yes.
you have to keep chasing
Yes,
all the
yes.
time.
And hopefully you find something that you can sell a lot of, a big lot of.
But that's such a big service to the community and to humanity, really, because at that time, and even when I was designing more heavily, influence came from the top and went down. In many ways, couture details were what sort of, filtered down, and there was a gigantic shift in about the mid-90s where actual street culture, Dapper Don of Harlem making those incredible Vuitton jackets out of cut-up counterfeit suitcases, and just genius stuff that was coming around. It's just such an interesting thing to be able to offer for everyone these really big ideas. So it's kind of important. Actually, the first dress I ever saw got knocked off was at the Limited. Yeah. It sure was. I remember it clearly.
Now,
And it came in lots of nice colors. You guys did a great job.
some people might think the phrase knocked off is a put down.
I'm sorry, purchased and
I find it a
duplicated, exactly.
That says you guys were good at what you were
No,
doing.
I agree. I'm sincere. It's a really nice service because if we made it, it would have been really expensive, but you guys made it really accessible.
So,
Thank you.
I'm sincere. I mean that. I was
See?
really kind of delighted about it because it showed us a certain cultural resonance that was surprising to me.
Well,
You know?
I think an important thing here to say is that what we were about was very different than cheap and deep pilot high, watch it fly.
Yeah.
We really,
Wow, there's a stack.
Huh?
That's a stack.
but it's true. That's what that business was about in those days.
Yeah.
And that was the key to success. But what we were about was bringing real fashion to our customer at an accessible price point.
But made well. It wasn't made in the, we have, you would think there'd be some synergy between like Forever 21 or
No.
H&M but the quality shifts between what you guys were focused on versus the fast fashion that really has to only last about your evening. It's a very different approach. No, I mean, they know
That's
that's
true.
what it's made for.
But then there are $4,000 dresses that only have to last an evening.
That's true. Yeah, you want to see, I've got rooms of them here if you'd like to see them. And the 4,000, those are the cheap ones.
I was thinking of the Academy Awards last night. No, not last night, 2 nights ago. Yeah. The most interesting fashion thing that I saw on the Academy Awards, interestingly, was Rita Moreno, who wore the same dress as she wore in 1960-something at the Academy Awards when she got one. So I think that's very instructional, the difference between style and fashion.
Oh, yeah.
Because what we were looking at Sunday night was by and large style. It was not time specific. So a great dress would be a great dress for a long time. And she looked great, didn't she?
oh, amazing,
Yeah.
amazing. See, I told you guys this would be a love fest. So, one of the things that I've most enjoyed about this exhibition personally is that every label was written by Todd in his voice and surfacing the stories about the fashions and the people behind them that were most resonant with him. And I encourage you all, even those of you who never read labels and think you're beyond looking at labels, these are storytelling, and they're really magnificent. But what is so clear from reading them is that contrary to, you know, the make it fast, pilot high, let it fly, these were labors of love that required artisans from around the world with very, very expert mastery of particular techniques, some of which go back 400 years. And the fact that Todd, with basically a studio that he began with, I think, $50 and the love and encouragement of his family, was able to build a practice that was capable of essentially encompassing that level of global talent and survive, because it wasn't a pilot high and let it fly kind of enterprise. So I wonder, Todd, because you do have such amazing stories, whether it's about the sari factory in India or some of the really extraordinary techniques that these artisans employed on your behalf and under your guidance, if you would share a little bit of that. And I think it goes to what you loved about those 16th and 17th century fashions that people invented.
That you can see that human hands have touched these things. You know, we embrace sort of an automated world, and there's lots of greatness that comes from that, but we lose this, I don't know, the natural DNA joy of being near things that humans have touched. And I loved that you could tell that these clothes were made by hand. I remember speaking to Megan about this little it's a black jacket that's all, the pockets are set by hand, and it's impossible to set satin pockets without seeing little bits of the bumps. And to me, that's the beauty of it, because you can tell that someone has labored to blindly attach this so that you won't see the work. I mean, it's that kind of caring. It's like the linings in those things are bonkers. Many of them you can't see, but in lots of cases, the lining fabrics are more expensive than the exterior fabrics.
That's actually something else. There are 7 or 8 very short 2 to 5 minute videos where Todd is describing some of the individual clothing, and in fact, you do see the inside of these things that I have to tell you, if you try and look at in the galleries, the guards are going to have to arrest you. Especially if you try and lift up those 25 yards of fabric that were hand printed by the RISD students under Todd's guidance, and which hide how many yards of tulle? I don't know.
Oh, it's something like 1,500 feet of tulle.
1,500 feet of tulle. So the next time you fancy yourself parading out in a ball gown, just think about that.
Well, that was a very fun dress to do, because it was made for nothing other than the joy of making and being present while we were doing it. And I love RISD, and I get to go back, and I've been, since 1989, I've been popping in and out of that school. It's just incredible to me. And my office is entirely staffed from, with the exception of one person, from people from RISD. But because I was working with a textile class and knew this exhibition was coming, we spent an entire year making that dress. If you'll look at there's a label on the left side that lists every name of every person that worked on it. And we would go 4 at a time to the silk screening tables to create the fabric, and it has hundreds and hundreds of colors and hundreds of layers of printing on the muslin. Then we spent about 6 months hand embroidering and beading with paillettes that we had made to cover the entire exterior of the skirt. And then we had made another piece of fabric that was stripped into 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch strips and then knitted into the sweater that creates the top part, but the interior of the sweater was then beaded so that you just see little glimmers of the sequins through the openings of the knit. So it was a ridiculous amount of time spent for the only reason that it was a pleasure. And that is a very beautiful thing to get to do.
Can I say something about this? You know, you saying these things, it's very, very clear. When I looked at that show, opening night when I met you,
yes.
right? The thing that was the most surprising to me was that the clothing was at the level of the Met Costume Institute shows. And I thought that was very exciting. And I went home and I said to my wife, Arlene, you have to go see this because it's really great stuff. Oh. But that whole thing about the mixture of art and apparel, you know, which oftentimes does not come across. Oftentimes does not come across. You can see the attempt, but not at the level that you've done it, because it's not that you're knocking off Mondrian prints.
No.
Or Jackson Pollock, you know, Jackson Pollock, excuse me. You should have corrected me.
Yeah.
You should have corrected me, Sharon. I mean, I don't want to sound like a moron.
That would be impossible.
Okay, but that whole thing is different because you weren't imitating art. You were making art in those clothes.
Well,
that whole thing about the sweater with the beads underneath. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of thought that the great designers in history gave to clothing. Mm. And it's not the kind of thought we see today.
Well, thank you for your kind words. I think the reason we don't see much of it is because it's like insanity level work. It involves the participation of like-minded insane people to get there. Because like one of the jackets is a black corduroy jacket, but we buried cut seed beads in the dent of the corduroy. So it only is seen when you move in specific ways or you bend, and I recognize that as a perhaps insane thing, but it was so lovely and it made me so happy to see it.
I bet your studio assistants thought it was pretty insane too, huh?
Well, no. I have everyone around me agrees that it's okay to bother. So I never get any raised eyebrows
Wow.
about our efforts
for you.
around there.
That's great.
Our concern was very different. Our concern was standing in Hong Kong all those years ago and making that sequin skirt to sell for $70 at a high margin.
Yeah, that's hard. Well, we just had to make one of those. Can you imagine if you had to duplicate that or make 1,000 or however many hundreds of thousands you made of things?
Hundreds of thousands.
Wow.
Right.
That's incredible.
Kind of not possible, right? But going back to something that you said earlier, this kind of idea that you have this atelier of really, really dedicated craftspeople, but in the end, it kind of limits the volume, the reach. It keeps the price points very, very high. And at that moment that you decided to leave fashion behind, it was sort of like, why am I doing this and for whom? But somehow, Todd, deep down, you must have known how profoundly you sort of changed the idea of that sort of forced obsolescence. And I think where you see that is that there is nothing that is absolutely just and only 90s about the work in our galleries. If I could fit into them, I'd wear any of those things today.
Oh, that's sweet. Well,
And I mean that. And also the fact that even though you made them as particular ensembles, you've chosen to show them in a sort of mix and match where things that went down the runway in 1993 are paired with things that went down the runway in 1997 or what have you, which sort of demonstrates, I think, a slightly different ethic that you had in the way you went about designing things.
Well, I just never thought, I don't understand the world of fashion where you're forced to, like you said, planned obsolescence. You make what you just did 6 months ago, and they often collide, these two things. Oh, you don't want that anymore, you want this. And then, a few months later, oh, you don't want this, you want that. But that didn't make any sense to me. I come from very practical parents and have always had this ridiculously practical side, which I'm sure is in full evidence upstairs. But they are practical because you can wear them. If you need to go pee in one of those evening gowns, I've got you fixed. The zippers on some of those gowns, they zip upward. So, I mean, I was
Bless
imagine
you.
if you have to go pee in an evening gown, that's hard. I mean, I don't know this, I projected that it's hard. But I thought this was a good solution because if you can unzip the dress this way, then you could pull it forward and do what you needed to do instead of trying to get it on the floor. So that's the practical stuff I was talking
Okay, so
about.
I'm just going to say it shows the paucity of news cycles, real news cycles these days, that literally 2 days before the Academy Awards, something flashed across my screen in one of those sort of news feeds from Vanity Fair or whatever. Actually, the title kind of made me sick. It was, how the stars pee in their finery. It's like, really? The world needs to know that?
Yeah.
But I'm glad someone was
sorry
thinking
I brought
about
it up
it. No,
tonight, but I just meant it from a practical point of view.
no, precisely. But we didn't need to read about it.
No.
But the other thing,
Somebody needed to write it.
I guess,
Wow.
the other thing that I find looking at the clothing, even though, of course, they're naturally on static mannequins, is that you can sense their movement. And in watching you describe how you made some of those things, it's one of the really, really magical factors about them because they look amazing, absolutely still, but they also really move beautifully on somebody's body, no matter how they swish and swirl. And I wondered if that was something that, like, just innately from the outset, you determined that you wanted to do. And I ask that as someone who's walked into a dressing room having taken something off the rack that looked really good And then if I put it on and stood still, it looked okay. But as soon as I tried to move, it was absurd.
Yeah.
So how do you intuit how that works?
Well, I knew I was in service. I love being in service. Why I breathe. So it was really nice when I was in service to making someone's evening or experience the best they could. I took it really seriously. So, clothing, I worked with a lot of artists and artisans that made those things. I'm not sure about clothing being art. I'm a little conflicted with that. But its main difference is that it's a 360 experience. I mean, most everything in museums we experience flat on a wall, with the exception of sculpture, of course. So clothing has different tenets to make it successful. But if you can't move in it, or it's uncomfortable, or if it's gapping, or all your parts aren't in, that's not going to be good. It has to work.
Not attractive if all your parts aren't in either.
No, you should choose which parts you want out.
Well, precisely.
Yeah.
I feel the need to
I'm
defend
buttoned
our
up
honor.
to the neck.
Go ahead.
I do feel the need to defend our honor.
Okay.
Because it's not all about, even at our level of the market, I don't believe it was ever about planned obsolescence. It was certainly about selling something new, but it was more about discovering what the look would be that 20 years or 30 years hence, when you were looking at a movie that was made in the teens, you knew when it was made because it had the look of that era. Okay? And that's the way you do a lot of business. So, we had this fictitious character that we talked about all the time, Phoebe Zeitgeist. And the question was, and it still is to me, what will Phoebe be wearing? Because if we could discover what Phoebe Zeitgeist would be wearing, we would know what to make a whole lot of. Because that was the key to our business, making a whole lot of something that was not from way back, but would define this era.
But it was much easier to do back then because I think we lost our national cooperation with trends probably in the late 70s. Remember, like, your dentist and your babysitter and a 4-year-old all had on bell-bottoms? It was a very unique kind of situation, and we're not united on anything except for yoga pants, unfortunately. But
And I think there's a reason for that.
Yeah, no, there probably is.
I think there is a reason. I could be wrong. I generally am when it's bad habit. But I think the reason for that is that the fashion industry has abdicated all authority.
Oh, that's true.
If you abdicate authority, there's nothing left.
Yeah.
Because fashion is the fashion business and the business of fashion is really about being authoritative about what's right and what's wrong.
Appearing to be, I guess.
Appearing to be, having people believe you are.
There's the trick.
Okay,
Yeah.
but that's reality. If they believe you are, you are.
Yeah.
If they take your word for it and they buy that, you've succeeded. So if you talk about the abdication of authority and you talk about looking at movies from previous years, and if Audrey Hepburn in Sabrina or Roman Holiday flashed on that screen, everybody would know that movie was made in the 50s. Everybody would know it. If Julie Christie flashed on that screen in Darling, everybody would know it was the 60s. Jane Fonda in Clute with the
skin-tight brown turtleneck? I guess I've seen that a few times.
Yeah, the poor boy knit sweater.
Have you guys seen this, Clute? It's
The
incredible.
poor boy knit sweater with the mid-calf straight skirt and a belt over the sweater.
Her name was
Everyone
Bree.
would know it was the 70s, right? After that, not so easy. The 80s had a couple of looks that really sold big. Power jackets, more in the way
Dynasty.
of, big tops over skinny pants.
The foam business must have been really significant at that time with all the...
Yes, it was.
Do you remember all the people walking around and then places, I'm not saying limited, but some places that put these enormous pads weren't placed well and ladies would walk around with these big blobs, or one in the back and one in the front kind of thing?
It was either shoulder pads slipping or push-up bras that were too much of a push-up.
They just collided at some point, I guess.
Yeah, they met in the middle. I remember being in India, and we were making one of the best shirts we ever had. And we had found the sample in Tokyo, so we named it Tokyo Tales. And it required shoulder pads that were each about that big. And more difficult than weaving the goods and making the goods, because you're talking 1,000,000 yards.
Wow.
More difficult than that was acquiring the appropriate shoulder pads, because if they were not good shoulder pads, the shirt couldn't sell.
That must have been the trick.
It was a trick.
Also setting, this is some macro information for you guys, but also it's very hard to set a shoulder pad with a sewing machine. You have to set them by hand properly. And so this is an interesting fact, because anytime these high ideas collide with mass merchandising, sometimes it works, most often it doesn't. But now that fashion's reversed itself and we're looking at everything from, look at, Chanel hoodies, and it's all going, it just totally inverted, and it doesn't seem to be stopping.
And I don't think it will for a while.
No, which is a shame.
So I think we need to invent a new Phoebe zeitgeist. I think we do. I feel that way. I feel like I could identify not even just trends, but a certain kind of fashion dynamic that goes with different decades. And I don't see it now. Maybe that's okay. I
Until
don't know.
very recently, and maybe including very recently, except we're not merchandising to it. People knew that clothing had a purpose. Not only did it have an end use, but it had a purpose. Clothing was some kind of a tool, really was. Whether it was what kind of a tool? It either enabled you to associate with a certain group. There's an associated value. It defined who you wanted the world to think you were. It was all kinds of things like that. People still think that way, I believe, but nobody is out there accommodating that thought.
So what would that take?
You know something? What it would take is getting back to the same word, authority. Because if there was fashion authority, you wouldn't see, the only place that I ever see today, fashion authority is in Us magazine, I swear. You get a double-page spread on the same look, right? Vogue, the cover will say, and it used to, I'm quoting a cover from a few years ago, 727 looks for spring.
That'll keep you busy.
You'd have to change 5 times a day. Huh? You'd have to change 5 times a day at least.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind 727 interpretations of the look for spring.
Whoa, that sounds exhausting.
Not as exhausting as 727 different looks.
Yeah.
And just
Different
imagine,
world.
if Anna Wintour can't accomplish authoritativeness, who
She
can?
doesn't have to. What Anna Wintour wants, I believe, is to sell magazines. And if the way to sell magazines is to write about, I don't know which magazine that was in, how you pee in all those clothes.
Oh, no, that was an online Vanity Fair thing.
Good. Yeah. I was starting to think less of them than I currently do.
It wasn't Anna's fault.
But that's where we're at. It's where we're at. There's nobody taking it on.
But is that even possible? Do we need it? I don't think, I wouldn't listen to somebody that told me this was the way, or the only way, I guess. Somebody agree with me?
Somebody agrees out there.
I think we need more sincere options versus authority. Because if something's really considered and there's real love and passion behind it, then it will be relevant and meaningful to some folks. I think we're too fractured as a society to
Maybe
sign up.
authority is the wrong word, because authority today has a very bad connotation.
Yes, it does.
And I understand that. It's not fascistic authority. It's not that's what I'm talking about. It's the ability to make people think that this is the way I want to look. That ability. This is the way I should look. This is the way people will notice me as being part of whatever it is that I want to be a part of. So to me, that's fashion authority, but it's not a fascistic kind of ordering
Different
people.
approach.
I think the worst thing that I see is that the worst thing that I see that kills the fashion business is when I read things about, oh, just wear what you want. Wear what you want.
I say that all the time. It might have been my fault. Sorry.
If you want to come up with that zeitgeist look, there has to be something more than wear what you want.
Yeah.
There has to be an inventiveness, a design, the imposition of abstract value.
Yes.
But the funny thing is that even in this culture of wear what you want, everybody's a curator of their own fashion, everybody's a curator of their life. But at the same time, when you're out on the street, everyone seems to be looking a lot like the person next to them and the person next to them and the person next to them. So there is still a kind of herd mentality, even in this moment of no zeitgeist.
Not in something that defines the time. Unless you think, and I think that jeans with rips in them are really great, but it's not the whole world. It's not what you saw Sunday night.
But it just offers the wearer to sort of, they function as personality amplifiers of sorts. You know, they project that you, a breezy attitude, a false I don't care, you know? So it's an interesting, interesting the way these tools are used. You know?
And yet, I think it's really fascinating that that august institution, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, clocks in more attendees for its fashion shows than for anything else they put under that roof, by hundreds of thousands. And so clearly, even though people seem to want to do their own thing, they are still attracted, they gravitate toward extraordinary artistry and creative innovation, including, you know, a show that I saw there, maybe second only to the McQueen show, which was one of the most extraordinary fashion. You can't even call it a fashion show. It was so brilliant.
Savage Beauty.
Yeah. Oh my God. This was
incredible.
it was phenomenal. And the show just a year or so ago, which I think was called Manus Ex Machina, which was all about technology and fashion, was to me maybe a kind of indication of where this thing called zeitgeist might be going. But even then, it was, you know, one of a kinds and clearly came out of ateliers where 100 people had been working for 100 days without sleep.
Could we go back like 4 sentences?
Yes.
Okay, so you said that even though people want to do their own thing, I dispute that. I don't think they do. I really don't. I think they do. I think by their own thing, if they want something that they look good in, that's designed for their body, they want something that is appropriate more or less to their age, unless you're spending time in Palm Beach and then you don't believe that. You know, but appropriate to their shape, appropriate to their life. But, you know, you look at lists in newspapers, in magazines, in and out lists. There was never an in or out list that some woman didn't read, whether she cared about it or not. You don't see that anymore. You don't see that anymore.
I never read those lists.
I know, you don't want to see it.
I don't.
I know. I know. But yet, you're very well dressed, always. And that comes from something. It comes from some kind of an exposure and some kind of a desire.
It comes from being a very chubby little girl who could never find clothes to fit her.
Whatever.
That's what it comes from.
But that doesn't mean that you're going to buy, being a chubby little girl doesn't mean you're going to search out Japanese designers.
No, fair enough.
You know, come on, let's be fair. You know, you're not
Their
driven by that
architecture,
chubby
no,
little girl.
I'm driven by extraordinary design, but design in a kind of elastic definition of
Yes.
the word.
We are all driven to make our basest needs elevated. You know, we are. I mean, if somebody says, well, I want that because she's wearing it. I want that because all the girls in the class are wearing it. They don't say that anymore, but they want it. And I'll tell you they want it because when they really want it, a store like Express sells 1 million of them.
So I keep wondering when that starts. Todd, you're doing a lot with kids now, the craft kits, but also some of the fashion you're doing for kids. At what point does that kind of more herd-like mentality kick in? Because it does seem that there are still a precious few years where kids really do want to do their own thing.
Yeah.
And
Well, I certainly find that, and because we do things for kids, they deserve the very best, and you have to be exemplary in every effort for children. It's not, if you do things for adults, it's a choice, but when children, it's almost always plopped down. They're not cracking wallets. It's something that's put in front of them, so it better work. And I think because they deserve the very best, you can create opportunities for them to grow, because creativity offers, problem solving, confidence. There's a million attributes, whether you're a lawyer, a teacher, or becoming an artist. They're all really vital. So we love to kind of make sure that we can work for those things. But I think the herd mentality comes when a lot of it's from the parents. I think, and also if you participate in herd systems. I mean, schools are obviously groups, but I think every time you tippy-tap on your phone, you're participating in a herd system. I mean, so just stop participating in herd systems, and it will be better.
okay, so that's my excuse to my staff out there for not being on social media. I hope you'll forgive me.
Well, it's fine, and there's all kinds of marvelous things about, I mean, especially Instagram is super fun because it's like getting to pin a photograph or something on your bulletin board that you want to share with your friends. And it's not as, I don't participate, that's the only one I participate in, and it's not very toxic. So that's good.
You know what? It's just me. I don't know why.
Well,
I
you're
don't
busy.
gravitate to it, but I'm thrilled that everybody else does. So,
But I don't know about that. I don't know if I all the way agree with the thrilled part.
okay.
Well, I spent Christmas.
Sometimes happy.
Well, I had a great, I adore my family. We have a really tight family. I spent Christmas, all my nieces and nephews were dull as dirt this year. And they were all stuck in their phones, and they weren't doing all the fun things that we did when we were kids. So I'm projecting on them exactly what they should do, but they were not present. And it was because they were in their phones.
Well, it's
Scary.
a kind of manual labor, but it's very specific, and it doesn't have applications that would lead to the kinds of things that you did.
No,
As-
perhaps
it-
you could,
it's
I bet you could
it's
bead
literally
well if you can
digital.
do phones well.
You do it with your digits,
Yeah,
that's it.
texting will lead you to embroidery. It's a gateway, great way.
Yeah. So I guess to kind of bring this to a graceful conclusion.
Good luck.
Yeah. I'd love to know if there's anything about that decade that you particularly miss and that you would say you've managed to kind of carry with you even as you left couture fashion behind but continued your pursuits in all of these other genres.
Well, it was an attitude I had from a very young age, but it was one I think I got to share in a way that made me really happy. It was in the 90s, I was on a show on MTV called House of Style for 4 years, and we did all kinds Thank you for remembering it. We had a lot of fun, but it was an unusual situation because it was really just 3 of us that were kind of running it, and we were all really curious and interested in passion and design and all attributes of the arts, but we weren't attached to commerce in any way. So we would, I would interview John Galliano, and then we'd show you how to redo a backpack for 99 cents, and it all was given the same weight. And I loved that, and that's what I still approach everything I do in that same way, but I'm just shocked that no one ever picked up that mantle. When Half the Style kind of, ended, usually somebody else steps in, but that point of view was so unique, and because MTV was basically, the adults weren't home, I would turn in my tapes, and they'd say, you have 4 minutes. Okay, what are you going to do? Here's the tape. And they would broadcast it to the world, whatever I handed over. It was really weird. I mean, can you imagine that now? So it was a really special time. That's the only thing I miss, is this really universal love of creativity and art without being attached to commerce. I wish that there was some public broadcast that made it that made it as attractive and ticklish and fun as we did.
Well, if you want to come back here every Sunday for the next several weeks, you can participate in what our education department is creating for families called sewing circles, and it will be just that. And I don't know that they've decided whether or not they're going to ban digital devices from the premises that day, but I kind of think they should.
Well, there's richness in being present during analog experiences,
Absolutely.
for sure. Well, we can't be, being a Luddite is not being present any longer. And
No.
the name of our kid-made, our stuff for kids is called Kid-Made Modern, and we say it's a kid that holds digital and analog sensibilities equally, not tipped one towards the other. I want them to do more analog stuff, but we pretend like it's exactly the same, and then you can be really rich, because, you remember doing fashion. It was so hard. There wasn't a computer that touched a thing that's in this museum. Every bit of this was analog, done completely by hand, but now we're making children's clothes, and I would say it's 10 times easier now than it was. So which makes me wonder, why the hell doesn't it look better? If it's 10 times easier, come on, you guys get busy. It's so, like for instance, if we made a fabric, I would have to hand paint the repeat. We'd send it to Italy, pay thousands and thousands of dollars just to get our 30 yards back to be able to make the clothes to see if we liked it. And now it's press a few buttons and the fabric's in our house in 5 days. And we've ordered 1.5 yards. It's a very different experience. So take advantage of this beautiful, the digital assistance.
So I know there are a lot of students in the audience tonight. For either of you, any sort of words of wisdom, encouragement, thinking back on, the beginning of your trajectory in this world, and particularly, Todd, your connection to RISD and your clear sort of focus on kids and preserving that innate creativity. What would you tell those 20 to 25-year-olds that are at OSU or CCAD?
Shall I go? You go first?
Well, I would tell them that specifically, if they're interested in this industry, they've really got to love it. They've really got to want to do it, and they've really got to get to a point where they don't become a one-trick pony, because too many people have one success, and they think that they're going to get paid back for that for forever, and it's not true. I think one of the greatest business lessons I ever learned was in my Shakespeare class. Let virtue seek not remuneration for the thing it was.
Wow.
Troilus and Cressida.
Sounds like a not-for-profit organization to me.
Well,
Kidding.
but
it's true.
It's true. It's
It's
absolutely
true.
true.
In the crassest possible terms, it is, what did you do lately? And that's what our business is about. What did you do lately? The other thing is hope for the day. Hope for the day when you can listen to your mother talking to your aunt who just went shopping and saying, well, what are they showing? And getting an answer.
That's good advice.
Okay, so it's up to you all out there to provide that answer.
Well, I get to work with a lot of students and a lot of young people, so I have a few things I try to share that were lessons I learned along the way, which is you must do. You just have to start, and you can never stop. You must dive in and be as thirsty for information and historic information, future information, things you can figure out. Start creating new. Start creating new technologies, new connective tissues, new way of seeing. No one needs you to redo anything from the past again. We have people that are excellent at it. So just try to be the richest, thirstiest, most endlessly interested person you can be. But no matter what kind of fuel that takes you to get here, you must do. You just have to work. I started out, as you mentioned earlier, with $50. That's absolutely true. I borrowed it from my family to buy thermal knit, sewed all the clothes myself, sold them, and then I made a few $100s, and then I could pay them back, and I knew I just kept multiplying it and multiplying it and multiplying it. And it works. So if you get stuck and things feel overwrought or too daunting, just miniaturize it. That's my trick. So let's say fashion. So what do you have to do? You got to think of something, make it, find somebody to buy it, duplicate it, and get paid. So that's 5 things. I can do 5 things, right? That doesn't seem that hard. So if you can kind of sort it out, hit your beats, then it takes out a lot of the worry about possibility. And also, it absolutely does not matter if you fail. Fail is fantastic. Just remove any sort of anxiety about that word, because fail is creativity with new doors flung open. Because if you don't embrace the endless possibility and stop the judgments, because it always can lead you to someplace else. I have face planted weekly my entire life, and I love it. This is from Sunday's face plant, by the way. But it's really important, because if you're doing it right, you're going to fuck it up and fall over. And then with that strength and knowing you've given it your best, you can stand back up and keep going. And start making new paths. Don't lament a broken system. Step to the side, pave a new road, go. Just don't accept the rules.
One more thing. I think that the fashion business is a business of track record. Mm-hmm. And, you have to fail. I mean, the best baseball player bats .400. Most of them bat less, which means they strike out 6 times or 7 times. And that, I'm agreeing with you, that is an important part.
It is. And then look at what failure means. In the case of striking out, it's literally just not hitting the ball, but that's less subjective than most of the arts. I mean, I might love it completely, you might hate it. We're both right. And that's the part that we can remember. Opinions are lovely. It's great to get them. Just consider them is all, and move on, because you have to be somewhat rigid in what you believe is right in your motives. And then if you're kind of be slightly inflexible there and be flexible in all other areas, and you will be happy with what you do.
I think the one other thing that you really have to learn in not only this business, but in any business, is how to recognize patterns, how to recognize the patterns of things, how to connect the dots and come out with an answer, knowing where the next dot is.
Yeah. Well, we need more. We need cultural translators, somebody that can not necessarily participate in the zeitgeist, but figure out what we need to make the world a better place. Because I mentioned how happy I am to be in service. I'm very sincere to that. And any of you guys that are embracing the creative arts are ultimately in service to your own creativity, to the world of creativity, to whatever that beautiful ether that the ideas come from. You have to be sincere. I know I'm speaking up here and I feel monastic about it, but it's very, very true. That is a truth I've seen over and over.
I'm joining your monastery. Thank you, everyone, and please thank Michael and Todd.
Thank you. It was lovely. Thank you.
Just give me 1 second, just a half a second, because I'm not going to be able to say this to a group of this size, but I'm going to miss Sherry so much. I think we have to really acknowledge that this center, which has gotten national attention, has been so important to the city of Columbus, is really, really her creation. There's clearly somebody built it, clearly people contribute to it, but that happens with a lot of institutions. I think she has done an incredible job, and I'm going to miss her a lot.